My name's Kevin Waite, and I teach American history at Durham University, where I'm a proud member of the Cuth SCR. And I want to tell you a bit about an American woman who, for roughly 40 years, wasn't even considered a woman, really in the full sense of that word. She was somebody's physical property. She was somebody's slave. Bridget, or Biddy as she was more commonly known, was born without a last name in 1818, a slave in the Georgia Cotton Belt. Now, to be a slave anywhere in the United States at this time was a pretty dismal fate. But to be enslaved in this particular time and place in Georgia in the early 19th century is just about as bad as it got. And that's because this part of the country was undergoing something of a cotton revolution right at the time that Biddy was born. And to meet this surging global demand for cotton, American slaveholders drove their human property pretty much to the limits of human endurance. But whereas millions of slaves would work and bleed and ultimately die on the plantations of the American South, Biddy actually escaped this fate. When she was about 20 years old, she began a long, strange trip, one that would take her out of Georgia and across the American continent. First to Mississippi, then to Utah, and then finally to California. She went as a slave, forcibly transported by her master, Robert M. Smith. But finally, in 1856, at the age of 38, Biddy won her freedom in a Los Angeles courtroom. And that's the story I want to tell really briefly here. How this slave woman, seemingly consigned to a life of hard labor and a death in obscurity, walked across the continent and broke free from slavery. And not only did she break free from slavery, she went on to become one of the most successful businesswomen and philanthropists in the young boomtown of Los Angeles. First as a nurse and a midwife, and then as a philanthropist and an entrepreneur, Biddy Mason laid the foundations for the African American community of Los Angeles. Now, like the stories of so many important women, there are some intrinsic difficulties in recovering this history. Biddy Mason left no records of her own. She was illiterate, in fact. In 19th century America, it was actually illegal to teach slaves how to read and write. And so by the time that she won her freedom at age 38, Biddy found that she could actually get along fine without literacy. So to recover her life story, we really have to read between the lines and against the grain of the archival record, records that were generally written by elite white men. And this might be why, despite the remarkable arc of her life story and the enduring impact of her accomplishments, there isn't actually that much written on Biddy Mason. So along with my co-author, Sarah Berenger-Gordon, who's a professor of law and history at the University of Pennsylvania, we're trying to bring some needed attention to Biddy's life story. And we're writing the first full-length biography of Biddy Mason. So really what follows here is some of the material that's taken from that biography. The story of Biddy Mason's journey and her triumph over slavery really begins in a somewhat unexpected place. It begins with the history of Mormonism. Mormonism was a new American religion closely modeled on Christianity, founded by a man named Joseph Smith in upstate New York in 1830. And within about a decade, Smith and his followers had converted tens of thousands of people, including a number of slaveholders in the American South. And Biddy's master, Robert M. Smith, no relation to Joseph, was one of them. Now, as this Mormon faith began to grow, it also began to encounter some pretty violent persecution. And in 1844, Joseph Smith himself was assassinated. And this prompted an exodus of Mormons beginning in 1847 to some place they hoped beyond the reach of this persecution to found their own independent religious colony. and they settled in a place that eventually became known as Utah. Robert M. Smith, along with about 10 of his slaves, including Biddy, was one of the early settlers of this colony. So here's a really crucial point. The road to freedom in 19th century America didn't run west. Biddy, sure, had escaped backbreaking labor in Georgia and Mississippi, but she wasn't really any more free in Utah than she had been in the Deep South. And in 1852, the legislature of Utah passed a slave code to emphasize this fact. The right to hold African Americans as property was inscribed into Mormon law. Now, in the popular imagination, the American West is this place of pioneering individuals. It's the place of gunslingers and saloons and cowboys and Indians and railroads and one-horse towns. It's the land of Clint Eastwood, not the land of enslaved women like Biddy. But what we're trying to emphasize in this biography that we're writing is that slavery had a transcontinental reach. And to understand the history of the American West, you have to sort of peel back this layer of gunslinger mythology, and you have to study the people whose stories have largely been lost, people like Biddy Mason. And the fact that slavery had a national reach had become very clear to Biddy when her master moved to a place called San Bernardino, California in the early 1850s. Now, California had technically outlawed slavery in 1850. It was a formally free state by this point. But officials within California basically turned a blind eye to the institution of slavery. So no officials registered any complaint when Robert Smith began importing his slaves into San Bernardino, just outside Los Angeles. By the mid-1850s, Smith actually owned 13 other women and children in addition to Biddy, and this made him probably the largest slaveholder in the American West by this point. But what Robert Smith never really expected was that a small group of abolitionists in neighboring Los Angeles would rally to Biddy's cause. In 1856, they helped defend Biddy and those 13 other African American slaves in a lawsuit against Robert Smith. As a result of that trial, which took place in a courtroom in Los Angeles, all 14 of those enslaved African Americans would finally walk free. So there we have it. Biddy is finally a free woman in Los Angeles in 1856. But aside from her freedom, she really didn't have anything to her name. She couldn't read, she couldn't write, and she had no property. In fact, Biddy didn't even have a last name at this point. So, now that she was free, one of the first things that she did was take on the last name Mason, which we think was an effort to reconnect with some of her long-lost family in Georgia. But once again, her life takes a wildly unpredictable turn. Shortly after winning her freedom, Biddy teamed up with a former slaveholder, a doctor named John S. Griffith, and she became a nurse and a midwife in his practice. And from the money that she earned as a nurse and a midwife, Biddy began to build her fortune. It took 10 years of hard work and saving, but she eventually acquired her first property. And from that property, she bought another, and then another, and then another. And this was all on land right in the heart of today's metropolis of Los Angeles. We're in the process of piecing together the extent of her real estate holdings. Again, the records are really thin on this. But we think that Biddy owned land on which some of the most iconic buildings in Los Angeles now sit. And in total, she accumulated tens of thousands of dollars in property. Some estimates suggest that she had as much as $300,000 in real estate, which is roughly the equivalent to $8.5 million in today's currency. Now, this was a huge sum for anybody at the time, but it was a truly unprecedented fortune for someone who really was the dual target of discrimination, not only as a woman, but as a black woman and a former slave. And she plowed most of this fortune into charity and philanthropy. Biddy gave to schools and visited prisons and supported other members of LA's fast-growing black community. One of her properties became the first black church of Los Angeles, a church that really remains a focal point of today's African American community. And in everything that she did, Mason embodied her own personal motto, quote, "If you hold your hand closed, nothing good can come in. The open hand is blessed, for it gives in abundance even as it receives." And that, very briefly, is the Biddy Mason story.